I'm very weary of being stared at and discussed and praised. What can one do to be forgotten? After I'm dead, they will rattle my bones about in their curiosity. Au revoir.
E. Lawrence was an enigma to his own time and continues to tease the imagination, represented as a crusader of the 20th century or as an introverted charlatan, as the man of action or as the effeminate poseur. He himself went to extraordinary lengths to avoid being labeled. He fitted himself with a variety of masks to escape the common scrutiny and played a succession of parts with an increasing world weariness, which he once expressed by quoting the old Greek epitaph.
Here lie I of Tarsus, never having married, and would that my father had not.
Ironically, this boy's father did not. He was an Irish baronet who fled from a wife and 4 daughters with their Scots governess to this gaunt house in North Wales, where Thomas Edward, their second child, was born. The family name Chapman was now snuffed out in the alias Lawrence.
My father was on the large scale, tolerant, experienced, grand, rash, humorsome, skilled to speak and naturally lordlike. He had been 35 years in the larger life and a spendthrift, a sportsman, and a hard rider and drinker. My mother, brought up in the Isle of Skye by a Bible-thinking Presbyterian, was guilty in her own judgment of taking my father away from his wife. To keep with mother, father had to drop all his old life and all his friends. She, by strength of will, raised herself to be his companion. But they thought always that they were living in sin and that we would find it out someday. Whereas I knew it before I was 10 and didn't care a straw. But they should not have borne children.
They finally settled in another gaunt house, Polstead Road, Oxford, for the new family required stability and education. One of their neighbours was A.H.G. Carey.
Father was a tall, slender man, very distinguished looking rather like Bernard Shaw, I should say. He had a red beard and whiskers, and he always went about in a Norfolk jacket and breeches, and was always waving when we passed him, very friendly looking. Mother I didn't see quite so much of, but I thought she was a bit frightening when I was young.
D.E., or Ned as he was called, was the most precocious of the 5 boys. He was reading Macaulay when he was 4 years old. And from all accounts, it was a happy, if strictly conventional household, sporting the proper uniforms for the Edwardian parade. In the Oxford of those days, the name Morris meant only the poet William and his revival of medievalism, an infection that the young Ned caught early. A spacious and leisurely Oxford, unaware of the industrial expansion soon to overtake it. The Oxford City High School. It was here that the 5 boys were enrolled in succession, their father, among the grocers, farmers, and tailors, describing his profession as of independent means. It set the family apart in one respect, and Ned is described as aloof by his contemporaries, though that might have been a natural diffidence. The old medieval town wall thrust itself into the playground. The history of old stone was to be a passion with him, castles and defences of all kinds a lifelong study, with which he infected his friends, Dr. Beeson, for example.
Well, I was in the same class with him about 1904 onwards. I didn't take a great deal of notice of him. He was a rather quiet boy. But then he suggested I might like to accompany him on brass rubbing excursions in the country around. He started going to churches around Oxford, and then further afield, rubbing brasses, which of course was a new and fascinating sort of interest which I'd never heard of before. And that led to the historical aspect of the persons represented in these brasses, and then to a much wider field of history. And then it so happened that there was a good deal of excavation taking place in the city to make the foundations of new buildings. And we used to frequent these diggings and found out that pottery of various ages was being dug up. And by offering threepence or sixpence to the workmen, they kept the specimens which they found, and we collected them later on.
Beeson, on a bicycle, was persuaded across to France with his sketchbook to study castles, pace out ground plans and draw elevations. Medieval romance supported by scholarship. And Ned already had ambitions to cut a figure in a romantic venture one day. And in this family of vigorous and independent talents, each was a spur to the other. 5 young men on the threshold. Many predictions were made for them. But war was to cut down 2, and give this third the chance to act out his ambitions, but only to a point. At the moment, he is developing will and powers of endurance, as though expecting some call upon them. The autumn 1907, he enters Jesus College to read history, but after his own fashion. He has a gift for gaining the interest of older men, Hogarth of the Ashmolean Museum, the Arabian explorer and writer Charles Doughty. These two especially persuade him to continue his study of castles, but in the east, Syria, an unexplored field of scholarship, to follow the route of the Crusaders. So in 1909, he sails to the east. He was not inoculated either against its diseases or fascination and succumbed to both. Farida El Arkel, a Lebanese schoolmistress, remembers the arrival of this young Englishman.
It was in December 1909 at a very small mission school in Jbeil that I met Lawrence for the first time. He arrived at the school on Christmas Eve when a group of us were busy wrapping up little Christmas presents for the children. It was a delight to us to have had him that short time, and I don't believe any of us had ever forgotten that sweet young Englishman. Well, when he got to know Arabic enough, he went up to his work. It was to study the Crusader castles. He took a very strenuous, hard trip that time. It was during the heat of the summer. He went through the country on foot for 3 months. It was a very hard trip. It showed how much he could endure of hardships, but he was ready to do it. He had a power of endurance beyond description.
Next day, I went on again with a huge march to 2 more castles and a bed for the night in a threshing floor on a pile of chopped straw, listening to the Arabs beating out their durra in the moonlight. Next day, I went to Tartus by another good castle, then struck far inland.
These are his own photographs, taken on that journey. It was a skill he learned from his father. He wrote up these studies for a thesis which has since earned him a footnote in historical scholarship. Most of the work is outdated today, but it did pioneer the field. And it helped him to gain a valuable first in modern history at Oxford, which led to a job with an archaeological expedition to Carchemish on the upper Euphrates, presumed site of an ancient Hittite city. He was back in the East and being paid for it, 15 shillings a day.
I have control over the pottery, But digging results have been meager and not very satisfactory to date. We uncovered a great entrance staircase with some Hittite slabs on each side. Lots of miscellaneous bas-reliefs have been got out, mostly ugly.
Lawrence was a great favorite with the workmen and established a natural leadership over them, intervened in their family disputes and patched up quarrels. In return, they brought him the luxuries of their tribal life to furnish his room, skins, pottery, rugs, until the little house resembled the quarters of a Bedouin prince. When the digging season ended in the summer of 1911, instead of returning to England, he set off on a long hike through Syria, where his powers of endurance were tested almost to the limit. Cuts festered, he had an abscess in the jaw and severe dysentery. His estimate of himself underwent its most rigorous test. But he wasn't only learning about himself. The unromantic East was revealed to him, the poverty and degradation brought about by Turkish oppression. He learnt it at first hand against a background of the remote magnificence of the past. In the winter of 1913, he goes to Sinai with an expedition ostensibly archaeological, but in reality a cover for a military survey ordered by Kitchener and conducted by a young engineer officer, Captain Newcomb. It was rather like two actors strolling on a stage where they would later play commanding roles, a stage where civilizations had risen and fallen, leaving little but the bleached evidence of mortality. And the stage was being prepared again for another futile performance. In Constantinople, other actors were assembling in their military fancy dress. Turkey was trying to make up its mind which side would win in the impending war. To the liberal British government, she was still, in Gladstone's words, the one great anti-human specimen of humanity. To the Germans, on the other hand, she was a means of closing the Black Sea and cutting off supplies to Russia. The Turks, therefore, preened themselves for offers. And with a show of magnificence, the Kaiser came a-wooing. His barge burned on the water. It was finally agreed that Germany would train Turkish troops. A military mission, modern weapons and money would shore up the rotting timbers of the Ottoman Empire and make her an effective ally. The Turkish crescent had carried deprivation to every province of the East. Their subject peoples had been bled white. Many possessed nothing more to be robbed of. Wherever these Janissaries had marched, they had taken an arrogance that turned to cruelty, and their torturings and executions had built up a pressure of hatred, particularly amongst the least servile of their subjects, the Arabs. The nominal ruler of the Arabs was the Sharif Hussein, who with his 4 sons had spent 18 years a captive in Constantinople, where he had nourished in them the spark of freedom which was now to blow into the flame of revolt. And since the Turks were allied with the Kaiser, Hussein put out feelings to Cairo, and secret negotiations with Lord Kitchener produced a guarantee of Arab independence if Hussein rose in revolt against Turkey. When war came, their hour had struck after many centuries, but it appeared that no one, however great his experience in previous wars, knew how to employ that hour, except possibly a rather scruffy and diffident Oxford scholar who had drifted into the map room in Cairo. His hour, too, had come, as he had always expected it would. He had ideas considerably above his station.
All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible. This I did. I meant to make a new nation, to give 20 millions of Semites the foundation on which to build an inspired dream palace of their national thoughts.
In briefest outline, the situation resolves itself into the British holding the line at Suez, the Turks with a northern base at Damascus thrusting down to the delta, but having to stretch a long arm down the Arabian Peninsula to safeguard the Hejaz Railway and subdue the tribes from the southern base, Medina. Hussein's sons, Abdullah, Ali, and Faisal, were attempting to invest this with ill-organized and dispirited sorties. All of this faithfully recorded in the map room by a bored Captain T.E. Lawrence, becoming more and more frustrated with red tape and red tabs. But in June 1916, Sir Ronald Storrs of the consular staff is going down to Jeddah to attempt to spur on Hussein, and Lawrence contrives to accompany him.
We had the accustomed calm ride to Jeddah in the delightful Red Sea climate. But when at last we anchored in the outer harbor off the White Town, then the heat of Arabia came out like a drawn sword and struck us speechless. Abdullah came to us softly with a bevy of richly armed slaves on foot about him. The Sharif's rebellion had been unsatisfactory for the last few months, standing still. And my suspicion was that it was lack of leadership, not intellect nor judgment, but the flame of enthusiasm that would set the desert on fire.
But Abdullah was not the prophet he sought, nor Ali, so Lawrence rode off into the desert to see the last of the sons, Faisal, encamped 200 miles to the north.
I felt at first glance that this was the man I had come to Arabia to seek, the leader who would bring the Arab revolt to full glory. Faisal looked very tall and pillar-like, very slender in his long robes and his brown headcloth bound with brilliant scarlet and gold cord. His black beard and colorless face were like a mask against the strange, still watchfulness of his body. His hands were crossed in front of him on his dagger.
What Faisal and his men felt about Lawrence has never come to light. They wanted substantial British aid, they got an Egyptian armored corps and a 5'6" English officer not yet 30. Faisal said, "And you like our place here in Wadi Safra?" "Well," replied Lawrence, "but it is far from Damascus."
The word had fallen like a sword in their midst. Everybody present stiffened where he sat and held his breath for a silent minute. Faisal at length lifted his eyes, smiling at me, and said, "Praise be to God, there are Turks nearer to us than that."
Another young British officer who rode with these men was Alec Kirkbride.
The tribal elements were born raiders. They had no military training at all. You could get a terrific charge out of them. If it came off, that was splendid. If it didn't, well, they ran away. That seemed to be the only sensible thing to do. There was no point in staying there and being killed. If they happened to loot anything of value, then their idea was to get it to a place of safety at once, quite regardless of the effect that their absence would have on the battle. On the other hand, were the regulars, who were practically all men who'd served in the Turkish army and who had volunteered to join the Arab cause. And by doing so, of course, they put themselves in danger of being executed as traitors. They, indeed, were the backbone of the whole movement.
Lawrence's khaki uniform was not the best dress, since Arabs associated khaki with the Turks, so he changed, at Faisal's request, into the white robes of a prince of Mecca, trying also to adopt the mannerisms and the way of life of the desert tribes. There were other British officers advising the Arabs, but none who identified themselves so closely with the movement, and none who permanently discarded their khaki. Here, with their bodyguard, in the only piece of film that survives showing them together, are the two chief actors, Faisal the Flame, Lawrence the Brain. They still needed the sword, and he was on his way to them.
I was about to take my leave when Suleiman, the guest master, hurried in and whispered to Faisal, who turned to me with shining eyes, trying to be calm, and said, "Auda is here." And at that moment, the tent flap was drawn back, and there entered a tall, strong figure with a haggard face, passionate and tragic. He might be over 50, but he was still strong and straight. He saw life as a saga. All events in it were significant, all personages in contact with him heroic.
Gold was the best slogan to make these adventurers undertake the long rides and the quick raids that were essential to Lawrence's conception of their part in the war.
Most wars were wars of contact. Ours should be a war of detachment. We were to contain the enemy by the silent threat of a vast, unknown desert. Suppose we were, as we might be, an influence, an idea, a thing intangible, invulnerable, without front or back, drifting about like a gas. Armies were like plants, immobile, firm-rooted, nourished through long stems to the head. We might be a vapor, blowing where we listed.
In Aqaba, then in Turkish hands, Lawrence saw the strategic center of his problem, since the revolt needed a northern base. So Auda's warriors prepared for a long ride and a quick assault. Surprise was their strongest weapon. Each man a self-contained fighting unit, they loped away into the desert on a wide loop that would bring them down on Aqaba from the north, its undefended side. The Turks were surprised, made a desperate stand in the approaches, but Auda led the charge, and they broke. The banner of revolt was carried a stage further. The map shows these tactics. From the first base at Wedge, the loop up. Aqaba on the Gulf, the British across on the coast, the goal Damascus. And the British fortunes were soon to change dramatically. An ineffective commander was to be replaced by Allenby, the Bull as he was called. He revitalized the campaign, understood Lawrence's part of it immediately, and Lawrence in turn revered him. "The nearest to my longings for a master," he wrote. Under Allenby's command, supplies and material began to flow into the base, and one of the drivers was S.C. Rolls.
I was a private in the light armoured car battery, and we were suddenly detailed to go to Aqaba. We were then put on road making. One day we just started work in the pass. We were fed up and bored stiff, when all at once Hassan, the Egyptian foreman, turned round and pointed with his whip to a group of Arabs coming silently down the pass. He said, "Arab no good, mush quais," he spat on the floor. I turned round and saw that the leader of the convoy was making his camel kneel. He came shuffling up to me, and I went up to him. I said, "Yalla, yalla, imshi, buzz off." See, I think he was after bakshish like they normally were. And he parted his kafir, and I saw that his face was red, not coffee-coloured. His eyes were blue-grey. And there was a smile on his face. He said, "Is your captain with you?" I said, "Yes, sir, certainly. I wondered what I was doing. I didn't know where I was." I was flabbergasted. That was Colonel Lawrence.
The camel was now partly replaced by the armoured car, thus increasing speed and striking range in this second stage, which was to unite the northern tribes and disrupt the Turkish supply lines. These were the arteries that Lawrence probed for now, and travelling became an uncertain terror for the enemy, as Lawrence strove to provide a succession of climaxes to keep his force from slipping away out of boredom or for Turkish bribes. His successes tied down enemy garrisons and cost them heavy in locomotives and rolling stock. Blasting operations were not only dangerous to the Turks. Kirkbride was with him on some of them.
I didn't approve of Lawrence's methods of blowing things up. He wasn't trained as a sapper, and he liked to make as big a bang as possible. He wasted a great deal of the explosives that had been brought at great trouble on camelback for hundreds of miles. And on this occasion, he put everything he could lay his hand on under the bridge. Knowing his habits, I said, "Now, please, sir, give me a little warning before you fire your charges. Let me get my men away." He said, "Oh, yes, all right, don't fuss, don't fuss." So we went down, and I was quite happily putting my charges in, and suddenly there was a most terrific bang, and the bridge flew into the air and fell all over the station. I was absolutely furious as a subaltern could be with a colonel, which had its limits. And he sat on a boulder and laughed at me.
But it was having an effect. The freedom and the austerity of the desert life satisfied some deep instinct in him. He could match the Bedouin in all their activities, for it brought his powers of endurance to a high pitch and took pleasure in keeping them there. He had to make many long, solitary rides in order to maintain the coherence of the tribes, for he saw it as part of his role there to preach as well as to fight.
We lived always in the stretch or sag of nerves, either on the crest or in the trough of waves of feeling, which made us live only for the seen horizon. Reckless what spite we inflicted or endured. Blood was always on our hands. We were licensed to it. Wounding and killing seemed ephemeral pain, so very brief and sore was life with us. We lived for the day and died for it.
The remarkable thing is that throughout the campaign, he carried a camera and took hundreds of these superb photographs, besides writing detailed dispatches for Cairo and keeping a diary and notes. For this was a literary adventure as well as a military one. He was planning to write a book one day, if he lived.
When the march or labor ended, I had no energy to record sensation, nor while it lasted, any leisure to see the spiritual loveliness which sometimes came upon us by the way. We no doubt enjoyed more the rare moments of peace and forgetfulness, but I remember more the agony, the terrors, and the mistakes.
Agony was waiting for him here, a dusty station to be reconnoitered. But the information he needed could not be got at a glance, so he entered the town in disguise. Derra. Here he was captured, passing himself off as a fair-skinned Circassian. But instead of prison, he was given a bath and taken to the commandant's bedroom. He refused the entreaties of the commandant, was taken downstairs, beaten and tortured because of his obduracy, and eventually used by the guards for their own pleasure. He had always kept himself clean for his purposes, but now felt himself irredeemably sullied. If the flesh was nothing to him before Derra, it was excrement to him after, and he was consumed with a loathing of it for the rest of his life. At dawn, he managed to escape and crawl back to an Arab encampment. He told no one what had happened, but those who knew him well noticed an indefinable change in his nature. Jerusalem, the next object in Allenby's advance on Damascus. With a great swinging blow through the Judean hills, it fell on December the 9th, 1917, and a triumphal entry was staged. Lawrence hurried back to be present at what he described as the supreme moment of the war. This, after all, had been the goal of the Crusaders. He was hastily fitted out with a proper uniform by his fellow officers for the occasion. It was just 3 weeks since Derra. Here he came across Lowell Thomas, who was later to play a very large part in his story.
I met Lawrence in Jerusalem. Allenby had called him in from the desert to decorate him in front of the Tower of David. I encountered Lawrence first on one of the narrow streets. He was with some Arabs. He didn't look like an Arab to me. And a little bit later, I got in touch with the British military governor of Jerusalem. I called him the successor to Pontius Pilate, Sir Ronald Storrs. And I told Storrs about this group of Arabs, and one who was a blonde wondered who he was. And Storrs opened a door to an adjoining room, and there he was. And Storrs was the one who was responsible for labeling Lawrence because he said to me, "I want you to meet the uncrowned king of Arabia."
The seeds of legend were being sown. Allenby was now poised for the final thrust to Damascus. The operation needed to be coordinated so that while Allenby pushed along the coast, the Arab forces would be brought up to cut the three main railway lines round Deraa and then advance in parallel on the eastern flank. As the British surged forward, the Turks fell away like the bow waves in front of a battleship. To stimulate the Arab part of this plan, Allenby poured £300,000 of gold, 700 pack camels, together with artillery and machine guns into their cause. The promise at last that their revolt would be crowned with success brought the tribes flocking to Faisal's standard. Their prophet had not failed them. The Turks broke to the east. 6,000 fell back from Allenby straight into the arms of the Arabs. But in their path lay a little village, Tafas, the home of one of the Arab leaders, Talal. The danger was realized. Lawrence, with Talal and Auda, veered off to prevent what they knew must happen. But they arrived too late on a scene of butchery.
Talal had seen what we had seen. He gave one moan like a hurt animal, then rode to the upper ground and sat a while on his mare, shivering and looking fixedly after the Turks. I moved near to speak to him, but Auda caught my rein and stayed me. Very slowly, Talal drew his headcloth about his face, and then he dashed his stirrups into the mare's flanks and galloped headlong, bending low and swaying in the saddle right into the main body of the enemy. We sat there like stone while he rushed forward, the drumming of his hoofs unnaturally loud in our ears, for we had stopped shooting and the Turks had stopped. Both armies waited for him. Then he sat up in his saddle and cried his war cry, "Talal, Talal," twice in a tremendous shout. Instantly, their rifles and machine guns crashed out, and he and his mare, riddled with bullets, fell dead among the lance points. Auda looked very cold and grim. "God give him mercy," he said. "We will take his price."
No power could restrain the massacre that followed.
By my order, we took no prisoners for the only time in our war.
And now, the prize within their grasp.
As we came over the foothills, there was this beautiful picture of the green gardens round Damascus, and the white mosques, and the minarets, and the houses in the background. It was all spoilt by the great clouds of smoke that were rising from the Turkish depots that had been fired. And on the plain between us and Damascus, we could see the stragglers of the Turkish rear guard, which were only half a mile ahead of us. And while we were standing looking at this view, there was a roar of a motor car behind us. And Lawrence came through past us in his Rolls-Royce tender. I waved to him, but he never looked. He was looking straight ahead through the windscreen. I don't believe he saw us. And he disappeared down the road, and we followed on our camels as quickly as we could.
September 1918. With the capture of Damascus, the Ottoman Empire fell in ruins. The confusion in the town was an image of this fall. Food was scarce, the water supply had failed, disease rampant. Rioting broke out. Political upstarts attempted to grasp power, and only Lawrence's agility prevented a revolution. He dealt out justice, made official appointments, and at last, when Allenby rode in, stood back in the shadows, exhausted both in body and in spirit.
Allenby gave me a telegram from the Foreign Office, recognizing to the Arabs the status of belligerents, and told me to translate it to the Emir. But none of us knew what it meant in English, let alone in Arabic. And Faisal, smiling through the tears which the welcome of his people had forced from him, thanked the commander-in-chief for the trust which had made him and his movement possible. Then Faisal had gone. I made to Allenby the last and also, I think, the first request I ever made for myself, leave to go away. In the end, he agreed. Damascus had not seemed a sheath for my sword when I landed in Arabia, but his capture disclosed the exhaustion of my mainsprings of action. The strongest motive throughout had been a personal one, present to me, I think, every hour of these 2 years. It was dead before we reached Damascus.
But he never disclosed, and nobody now will ever know what that personal motive was. At Versailles, what had been fought for in the desert had to be fought for again. The elegance of the surroundings in no way diminished the fierceness of this struggle. The statesmen took into their hands all the gains and losses of the wars, reapportioning territories with little consideration, it would seem, for the political consequences. The French were given Beirut and the Syrian coast, the Jews a home in Palestine, and the British kept Mesopotamia, discouraging all further notions of Arab independence.
The cabinet raised the Arabs to fight for us by definite promises of self-government afterwards. In this hope, they performed some fine things. And instead of being proud of what we did together, I was continually and bitterly ashamed. It was evident from the beginning that if we won the war, these promises would be dead paper.
He handed back all his decorations received from the British, French, and Italians. They were now shameful to him, gained under false pretenses. He slipped away from the sordid scene back to Oxford, All Souls College, where he was given a fellowship, a quiet room, and the peace to put his thoughts in order. He was 32 years old. The crusade he had ventured upon seemed now but a vanity, a cruel joke on his ambitions. His youngest brother, A.W. Lawrence, remembers his return and how this grim joke affected him.
He came back from the East, and to begin with, he took a certain amount of time off. We used to see him very often at home for weekends. Later on, of course, less often as he got more busy. He had always been a person of very remarkable control and poise. He either kept perfectly still when he sat, or else he moved neatly. And his choice of words was invariably very careful and fastidious. Well, this all went on after the war, but in addition, he developed a tremendous zest for anything comic. He'd obviously gone through tremendous difficulties and had done so by finding the funny side of them.
At this moment, Lowell Thomas arrived in London with a lantern slide lecture about the Desert Campaign. But Lawrence, not Allenby, became the romantic star of the story. Although the publicity was of great use to him in promoting the Arab cause anew, it created a simpering image of himself which was to dog him for the rest of his days. The man who despised his part in the campaign found himself now a public hero because of it, with the fan mail of a film star. Meanwhile, all the papering done at Versailles was peeling off, and in 1921, Lawrence donned a new disguise, that of civil servant, at Churchill's request, in order to join a committee attempting to make a more equitable settlement of Middle Eastern affairs. A conference was convened in Cairo, and in a fortnight of intense work, Churchill had the threads of a solution in his hands. Lawrence regarded the final settlement as a complete redemption of all the pledges made to the Arabs, felt himself free to leave the colonial office, took a room in Westminster, where he drove himself to rewriting his war experiences. Literature was to be a substitute for his Arabian ambitions which had failed. Pride and vanity might be soothed by creating a masterpiece, and he took immense and conscious pains to do just that. No such book has ever been written about a military campaign. He was not writing objective history, but the drama of a sensitivity worn threadbare by the contradictory tensions of his nature. And when it was done, he was disappointed, doubtful of its worth, and utterly drained. My brain nearly went in Barton Street, he said later, writing and rewriting that horrible book of mine. But in the writing of it, he burned out his part in the Desert War.
I have done with politics. I have done with the Orient, and I've done with intellectuality. Oh, Lord, I'm so tired. I want so much to lie down and sleep and die. Die is best because there's no reveille.
He was overwrought by 6 years of tension. He wanted to sever every link with the past, but he had no job. He wondered if a madhouse would not be my next and most merciful stage. So he reduced himself to the ranks and took the name John Hume Ross, and went with that name to the RAF recruiting office in Henrietta Street.
Ross? Yes, that's me. Nerves like stand up here. Make yourself as tall as you can. Hello. You just do. 5'6". What the hell's those marks? Punishment? And how long have you been short of food? All right, Lord, get back into your clothes. Best of luck. 7 years now before I need think of winning a meal.
So he marches into his new life, and according to the book he later made from it, The Minute, it was almost tougher than he could cope with. But he stuck out the first period and was transferred to the School of Photography at Farnborough. He arrived there one night to find only the hut orderly, Jock Chambers.
The little bloke looked rather lonely. I felt a bit sorry for him. He was tied up with all the gadgets we had. It was like a Christmas tree. And I helped him off with the equipment and shut down the hook. No, he shut down the hook. I felt somehow that I ought to be tough with him. I don't know why. And I said, now, don't forget I'm hut orderly here. And when you scrub that bed, short arse, you see you do it properly, no tide marks. He said, oh, all right. And he scrubbed it twice before I was satisfied.
But his legend was pursuing him. The press heard of the disguise and came down to harry him.
I was on guard with him when the Daily Express man came along, and the Times man. In fact, it was the Times man who said to Lawrence, who was actually standing on guard. He said, can I go in and see this bloke, Lawrence? So Lawrence said, no, I'm here to stop you. And he just casually said to him, you don't have to be in, do you? And he said, now, do I look like a soldier? That was all to it. This bloke walked away.
The Air Ministry panicked. This publicity was most unwelcome. Would you kindly resume your normal personality and leave us? Very bad for morale, this. In desperation, he then joined the Tank Corps, changing his name yet again to Thomas Edward Shaw. He went to Bovington Camp in the middle of the Hardy country in Dorset, where iron monsters churned up the heathland.
Every man has joined because he was down and out. We're all here, unavoidably in a last resort, and we assume this world's failures in one another. We're a social bedrock. Those unfit for life by competition, and each of us values the rest as cheap as he knows himself to be. The only rational conclusion to human argument is pessimism, such as Hardy's. A pessimism which is very much like this wintry heath of bog and withered plants and stripped trees about us. But there is a deeper sense which remembers other landscapes.
It was strangely like the desert, and was certainly a desert for the spirit. There seems no doubt that he was on the verge of a mental or a nervous breakdown. In this morbid condition, he wrote a remarkable series of letters to Lionel Curtis.
I lie in bed night after night with this cat-calling carnality seething up and down the hut, fed by streams of fresh matter from 20 lecherous mouths, and my mind aches with the rawness of it. We're all guilty alike, you know. You wouldn't exist, I wouldn't exist without this carnality. Everything with flesh in its mixture is the achievement of a moment when the lusty thought of Hut 12 has passed to action and conceived. And isn't it true that the fault of birth rests somewhat on the child? I believe it's we who led our parents on to bear us, and it's our unborn children who make our flesh itch. A filthy business, all of it.
He had but one consolation, one relief, and that was speed.
When my mood gets too hot, I pull out my motorbike and hurl it at top speed through these unfit roads for hour after hour. My nerves are jaded and gone near dead, so that nothing less than voluntary danger will prick them into life. And the life they reach then is a melancholy joy at risking something worth exactly 2 and 9pence a day.
One Sunday, with a friend, he rode north.
Wells we got to, and very beautiful it was. I trailed into the cathedral precinct and lay there on the grass and watched its huge west front. There was a white-frocked child playing with a ball, but from my distance she was so small she looked no more than a tumbling daisy at the tower foot. I knew, of course, she was animal, and I began in my hatred of the animal to balance her against the cathedral, and knew then I'd destroy the building to save her.
He could not resolve the paradox posed by the flesh and the spirit. But in this heathland, he found an escape hole for himself. It was a derelict 2-roomed cottage on Clouds Hill. It already figured in literature as the place where Eustacia Vi lived with her father in Hardy's The Return of the Native. Otherwise, his life was utterly bleak, and he wrote a letter intimating that if he couldn't get back into the RAF, he was going to put an end to his misery. The Prime Minister Baldwin was apprised of this by Bernard Shaw. There would be a scandal, said Shaw. So they sent for Trenchard, who eventually signed the transfer from tanks back to the RAF. This news, as T.E. wrote to John Buchan, was celebrated on a new motorbike, Bernurges, made to his own specifications by George Brough. 108 miles an hour with me on Wednesday afternoon. The news has gone to its cylinder heads. He went to Cranwell and was then transferred to India, but the press was still hounding him. He was now claimed to be a spy. Questions were raised in the House of Commons, and the Air Ministry found itself again embarrassed by the presence of this simple aircraftsman. He was ordered back to England, and elaborate preparations were made to prevent the press getting at him. These were in the hands of his old friend, Air Commodore Sidney Smith, who was sent to smuggle him off the ship.
Well, we saw the liner looming through the mist. At the same time, to my horror, I looked round, and my God, I saw all these little boats surging towards the liner, long before the lighter had come to take the passengers off. And I realized to my horror, by God, this is the press. So then I had to get busy and concoct a plan with the Lieutenant Commander. And he said, right, he said, I'll go along and pay my respects to the captain as usual, and then I'll get him to drop a hatch over the other side of the boat, and we'll get Lawrence through the hatch. Round we went to the other side, and the hatch was opened, and the rope ladder was let up, but unfortunately it hitched up on the handle of the hatch, and of course there was a delay. And there was Lawrence standing at the opening of the hatch. There he was, and they photographed him in the hatchway and coming down the ladder and into the pinnace. However, we shot away as hard as we possibly could in the direction of Plymouth, trying to throw him off, and then altered course to Mountbatten.
Mountbatten was to be his next station and Smith his next commanding officer. The work entailed servicing the flying boats, and his lifelong interest in things mechanical found an outlet. It was a small community of experts in which the deadening parts of service routine were set aside. Claire Sidney Smith remembers this.
And he found in Mountbatten a complete sense of family life, which he had never had before. And not only the family life with us, but in the whole squadron. We were one large family. And he felt the quiet and the peace of it. He wasn't disturbed, and he was able to relax.
The team had the challenge of the Schneider Cup races to keep them on their toes. This was work of national importance, and it led later to the Spitfire. Lawrence's ingenuity and his great gift for cutting through a mass of detail to the heart of a problem were of great value in these developments, and he earned the respect and admiration of men not likely to be impressed merely by a legend. The station acquired a small speedboat, the Biscuit, for joyriding. But after he had witnessed a tragic plane crash in the sea, it suggested to him another use, and he applied himself to the problem of air-sea rescue. With the designer Scott Payne and many others, endless experiments and modifications were carried out to produce high-powered, seaworthy craft. All this helped to restore his equilibrium. His instinct of service had been correct. The time of tension was over, and he cultivated again his many friends, using the bike to carry him for weekends to people like John Buchan, Siegfried Sassoon, and Henry Williamson, who remembers a long-promised visit.
Finally, he turned up one Sunday, coming right across Dartmoor from Plymouth to North Devon, where I lived, on his 10-horsepower, 100-mile-an-hour, Brough Superior nickel-plated motor bicycle. I remember I waited for him, and I looked below, and suddenly this man appeared from nowhere. The shining bike in the rain was put on the stand, and a little man came up the stairs with a minesweeper's suit on from head to foot. And he came in, and he smiled, and he nodded to our maid, and spoke to the boy and patted his head. And I just looked at him. He never looked at me, and I thought, what a marvelous person. And I began to feel very big and strong and happy and confident.
He was also improving Clouds Hill against the day of his retirement. Over the doorway, he carved in Greek the motto, O Frontis, I don't care. That was to be the spirit of life there. Very simple. Sleeping bags in place of beds, his books and a gramophone, no kitchen, no electricity, no lavatory, rhododendron bushes outside. His friends could come and go as they chose, whether he was there or not. And eventually, it would be his permanent home when service with the RAF ended. His letters of this time are full of doubts as to what he would do on retirement. That future was a blank. He disliked the idea of being rudderless again. But the last day came at Bridlington, and he cast aside the anonymity of the RAF uniform. He had aged, broadened, relaxed, grown almost mellow, but the legends still clung. In Dorset, the press were waiting for him. His privacy was broken into. They threw stones at his roof to bring him out. The legend would not leave him alone. The peace he had looked forward to seemed remote. In fact, it was not far off. The 13th of May, 1935, his friend and neighbor, Pat Knowles, brought the post across.
Well, there was a letter from Henry Williamson saying that he was proposing to visit Clouds Hill the following day, and Shaw said that he was going to go down and send a telegram. He came across to me shortly before he went and asked me if there was anything I wanted, and shortly afterwards I heard him move off. Well, it was one of these very bright, clear days in May when the wind was southerly, and I heard him go all the way down to the camp, and I could hear the drill sergeants on the square shouting. And later on, I heard the motorcycle coming back. I heard the engine suddenly race and then stop.
The legend was now in the hands of the artists, the writers, the critics, and the idolaters. And they proceeded to fashion the various versions of him that have puzzled the imagination since. His friend Eric Kennington carved the effigy that now lies in St. Martin's Church, Wareham, the Crusader in his Chapel of Ease. But the legend still dogs him, growing, it would seem, more and more absurd. A.W. Lawrence has witnessed this rattling of the bones.
Fantastic legends started to appear about him soon after Lowell Thomas's show. The French had evidence at one time. They thought that he was stirring up a rebellion, leading it in Morocco. And he had to be dragged out of an Air Force camp in England and shown to the French ambassador. And that sort of thing continued all the time. He could have no reasonable private life. Such legends even went on after he was dead. Now he's become a subject either for extreme adulation or equally extreme denigration, the process having naturally gained strength as the witnesses to his actions have died off. In neither of these two figures, over-dramatized figures, the saint and the charlatan, can I really recognize more than a trace of the brother whom I knew and liked.
Certainly neither saint nor charlatan, nor indeed the simple soul in between. A complex, many-sided person, revealed in part at least by the memories of his many friends.
He should have been in a family, had his own family. Should have married or friends or something, but I'm sure he wasn't homosexual, as many people say. He was just self-contained and yet not self-contained.
In manner, he had always something a little reserved, a little clerical, a little celibate about him. But directly he got interested, he forgot that.
He adored mystifying people. He adored telling a bit of a story to one person, another bit, the same story to another, and then seeing what an extraordinary thing a third person made out of it.
Lawrence's greatness, to my mind, not in what he has achieved during the war, great as it was, his greatness lay in his wonderful character, in his personality, in that wonderful soul.
He seemed to me to be a man who had power over life. I couldn't exactly say what I meant by it, but I'd say that he was a man who could make things happen through his influence on other people.
It was this extraordinary power outside of himself, I think, that made him sometimes almost afraid of it. Because, again, in his own words, he said, you know, it is something which I can turn on or off like a tap.
And in my recollection, whatever task I gave him, he carried that task out with amazing efficiency. Even to sweeping out his barrack room, he did it better than the other man.
Beneath the extravagances of the legend and the abuse lies a human being whose achievements were substantial, who impressed himself upon his time and was the friend of men who did not suffer fools or charlatans gladly, but a man who nevertheless seemed to approve Yeats's verse, "Never to have lived is best," ancient writers say, never to have drawn the breath of life, never to have looked into the eye of day. The second best's a gay good night, and quickly turn away.